Okay, our topic is Parshat Mishpatim, which follows directly from Yitro, from the event on Har Sinai, the covenant made between God and the Jewish people. And of course, there was only 10 statements that were made at Har Sinai, but obviously there's a great deal more as part of this covenant than these 10 fundamental statements. So the Parsha of Mishpatim is giving us a sample compendium of the laws that are part of this covenant. And we'll see at the very end of the Parsha, the people are going to, after they hear everything, the whole Parsha of all of these laws, they're going to say, Kol Asher Yedaber Hashem Naaseh V'Nishma. We agree. So they heard a lot of these detailed laws and then they agreed to the covenant. So what we're going to do is to do three separate things. First, we're going to look at a big picture that doesn't come from Shimshon Raphael Hirsch because the information that we're going to talk about came about 5 years after he passed away. And the information comes from the codes of mainly from the Code of Hammurabi, which was discovered in 1902. Hirsch died in 1888. And one of the major scholars of the Code of Hammurabi, which is a code of law that preceded the Torah by a couple centuries, but was found luckily carved into stone almost in its entirety. And then it was decoded and translated, and it still is available, by the way, at the Louvre Museum. If you're ever in France and you want to see, in Paris, you want to see the actual Code of Hammurabi, it's there in the lower level of the Louvre. In any case, the scholar who has addressed the information that was found out in the codes of Hammurabi is called Umberto Cassuto. And we're going to talk about his understanding of the codes and its relationship to our Mishpatim, the laws of the Torah. He was a chief rabbi in Italy in the late 1800s and was thrown out of Italy and luckily decided to resettle in the Hebrew University of British Mandate, Palestine. In other words, he came here before the state of Palestine, before the state of Israel, rather, and the Hebrew University was functioning then at not in Givat Ram, but the original one on Mount Scopus was functioning then, and he became a faculty in 1938 and stayed there until he died in 1951. And it's his work that we're going to talk about. What we're going to address is the legislation that we see in Parshat Mishpatim, and then we're going to see it again in Devorim and Shoftim and throughout the Chumash, all Jewish law. Were these laws unique? In other words, is the Torah the first place that these laws occur? And number one. Number two, why weren't the laws presented systematically? If you followed the laning yesterday in Shul, you'll see that the laws are scattered all over the place. All the topics are not organized. It's not like the Rambam's Yad Chazaka, which organizes all the laws. It's not like the Tur. It's not like the Shulchan Aruch. These are compendiums of laws which are organized by topic. In Mishpatim, they're not organized. And so how come they're not organized, and what's the content of these laws? Why these particular laws appear and not other laws? So the thing that gives us a real hint to be able to understand this is to understand that there were a number of legal codes that were existent at the time of the Torah, and among those, which were found in the late 1800s, early 1900s, were Sumerian, Akkadian, and Hittite social civil laws, but the most famous and the most critical are the codes of Hammurabi, which the other ones, the Sumerian, Akkadian, Hittite, are mostly based on that one because that was the earliest, which was Hammurabi was the king of Babylonia around 1675 before the Common Era. So a couple of centuries before the uh, the time that we know the Torah was given. Okay, and they were found almost in their entirety on this steel, this stone column, and they were translated and published in 1902. So many scholars, both Jewish and Gentile, who wanted to distract or detract from the Torah's uniqueness, came up with the idea. These were the academics of the German academics in the late 1800s. They insisted that Moshe and other subsequent authors and redactors borrowed most of the Torah's legislation from other codes. And once they saw Hammurabi, they say, especially Hammurabi. This is called scholars of higher biblical criticism. Higher biblical criticism means there were a documentary hypothesis, there were many different authors over a long period of time, and then there was a redactor who put it all together, and that's how we came out with the Torah. So they challenged the notion that the Torah laws are God-given laws, and that the revelation on Har Sinai and the subsequent revelation of the laws during the 40 years in the desert were not the true story, but rather that people made up the laws over a period of time. So the Italian scholar, Professor Umberto Cassuto, that I mentioned, met this challenge. He said, no, that these scholars are wrong, and that indeed the Torah is a divine document, and it was given as the Torah describes it was given. And how do we address the differences between the codes of Hammurabi and other codes and the Torah? And he said, once we see the differences, then we can understand why the Torah is unique and why it says what it says and why it says the way it says it. So he says, first of all, let's make a comparison. In all ancient Near Eastern codes, the laws were promulgated by kings. In other words, all of the codes that we have, again, Hammurabi is the only one we have complete. The other ones we have fragments of. But in all of the codes that we have, they were promulgated by kings, and it reflected the civil practices or the king's will. In other words, this was it reflected what the king saw as needed in his kingdom. But what's important is none of the laws emanated from the will of the gods. Nobody claimed that their gods told them what the law should be. Rather, Hammurabi is the best example. He is proclaiming the laws, and he's asking his own relationship with the gods is he's asking them to bless him because he's doing good things for his people. But otherwise, the gods don't have any role in the laws. Second, all the codes are comprised of secular legislation. That is, they have issues of damages, of injury, of business dealings. In other words, it's all about everyday secular life. There is, within these codes, are not any religious or moral content. The religious codes were written by priests, and they were separate documents, and they didn't have anything to do with this list of secular laws. And third, the codes were imposed on all kings, on all under the king's rule. In other words, the king says, these are the laws of my kingdom, and what others said was irrelevant. There was no consent of the people. So this was the nature of ancient Near East legal codes. So Kasuto says, let's compare it to ours, compare it to the Torah. In the Torah was not decreed on behalf of a monarchy, and nor in the name of Moshe. In other words, Moshe did not come up with these laws, but rather all the laws were presented in the name of God. You remember how many times you read, Vayidaber Hashem el Moshe lemor, Daber el bnei Yisrael, v'yamarta aleim. In other words, God says to Moshe, this is what you are to tell the people, and then Moshe tells the people what God says. So there's where our laws come from. Our laws, in contrast, come from God, not from Moshe. Second, the Torah does not distinguish between social and civil law on the one hand, and religious and moral and ethical law on the other, as does Hammurabi. In other words, the legal system in Judaism, the Chukim and Mishpatim and Torot, are all grouped together. In other words, our civil law is also moral law. Our civil law is teaching us what is morally right or what is morally just. And they're
Steve,
not, we don't separate them. Yes.
I'm a little confused. A couple of questions. First of all, when you say the gods are not mentioned, what's Lo Tonu et Hager and the El Manah? Um,
No, in other words, the gods are not mentioned in the codes of law of Hammurabi or the other codes of law. The gods did not tell the king what to say.
okay.
In our
And
system,
right.
the Torah, the laws that were given by God through Moshe.
Okay. And also, when you say all the Chokim were grouped together, yeah, I was wondering
They're
about,
not grouped together. That's my point. That the
they're not grouped
chukim,
together.
the mishpatim, the social laws, the
Yeah.
ritual laws, the moral laws are all mixed up together, and and
Ah,
and that anytime there is a social or civil law, it is also considered as a moral law.
interesting. Okay, because yeah, I was
Okay,
wondering yesterday about the Lotavashel Gedi B'chelev Imo, why that seemed to be the only chok among all
right.
the different.
No,
Okay,
what Hirsch would do with that is to tell you what is the principle that's being taught through that particular ritual. And when we get to the next parshiot of the Mikdash, which is all ritual, there are moral lessons in all of that, as we'll see.
okay, thank you.
Okay, and then another contrast is in our system, the people proclaim their acceptance. Once the covenant, the book of the covenant, was read to the people, that is, the Aseret HaDibrot and the Parshat Mishpatim, their response was, Kol Asher Yedaber Hashem, Naaseh v'nishma. We'll do what God asks. Okay, so there was consent of the people. That's what a covenant did. A covenant is between two groups. The other laws, the other historical laws of Hammurabi and the Akkadian laws and the Hittite laws had nothing to do with the people. They were imposed by the king on the people, and the people um, didn't have to agree or have any comment. So, number one, that's a major contrast between the contemporary codes of law and the Torah's law. There's, in other words, an inherent contrast. Now, when we get down to the laws, we'll see more of a contrast. Why these sets of laws? In other words, why did the Torah pick examples of certain laws that it did in Mishpatim, like laws of slavery, laws of damages, laws of injury. So his answer, Kasuto, is since the Torah is primarily a moral and ethical document, the laws it chooses to present throughout the book serve either to introduce amendments to existing legal traditions. In other words, the Torah is not necessarily giving unique laws. Right? Most of the laws are present in other systems of law. However, the Torah introduces amendments to existing legal traditions, or it may oppose or invalidate certain elements of these laws. In other words, it may state a law that we find in other codes, but then oppose it or invalidate elements of it. And we'll see examples of that shortly. Or it may confirm in God's name. In other words, since this is God's Torah, aspects of existing laws that are worthy of being incorporated into the society of Israel. In other words, those laws, which are basically just laws the way they are in fact copied from these, or not copied, but they are similar to the laws that are found in other systems, if those laws are fair and just. So then the Torah, by repeating these laws or incorporating these laws, are validating that they're worthy of being accepted within the Torah's system of laws. And finally, the Torah introduces unique laws which represent the Torah's unique value system. In other words, there are some laws that don't appear anywhere in any of these other codes. For example, there is no concept of a Shabbat, of a 7-day period of rest, of work. It doesn't exist in any other ones. There is no concept of Shemitah. There is no concept of Yovel. There's no concept of many of the social innovations of the Torah in any of the other documents. That's unique to the Torah. But, for example, in other documents, there are things in which the king requires tithes, requires farmers to give some percentage of his produce to the king. So the Torah also has laws of tithes. We also have truma and maser. Now, we do it differently than they do, but the concept of the people as a nation contributing to the legislative body of the nation is in every other code of law as well. So those kinds of things we also have. So in other words, what we have is not entirely unique, but it includes unique laws. It's not entirely different from other legal systems, but we change them often. And here's examples of these kinds of changes. First of all, the laws that are presented in the Torah are presented as principles, not detailed legal procedures. In other words, there are common practices that appear in all other codes of law. For example, business contracts. Business contracts are a major part of other compendiums. Okay, they tell you what, the buyers and the sellers and what they agreed on and how they should write contracts and so forth and so on. We don't have that. We have it in Torah Shebaal Peh. We have it in the practical application of just laws of business, but it doesn't appear in the Torah. Similarly, marriage ceremonies don't appear in the Torah. Now, there are certain things involved in who you can marry and who you can't marry. That's in our Torah, but not what a marriage ceremony should look like. And so the common practice of marriage ceremonies was acceptable to the Torah. And similarly, the contents of divorce documents are not presented in the Torah, but when you can give a divorce and under what conditions, that is mentioned. In other words, the moral issues associated with marriage and the moral issues associated with divorce. And the moral issues associated with business, that's in the Torah, but the actual practices are not. And in fact, if you think about it historically, think about how we do a marriage ceremony. And you're talking about even in the Haredim, how did we do marriage ceremonies where the bride and the groom walk down an aisle and they appear on a bima? Now, the chuppah is unique to us, so forget the chuppah. But the whole ceremony of people sitting on both sides and the chassan and the kala coming down the middle, and there's music and all of that, that's not in the Torah. That's actually, it's taken from the Christian practices in all of the countries under Catholicism and under Christianity. They had these ceremonies, and we adopted those ceremonies because there's nothing religious about it, but it's a manner in which you do marriages. And the same thing with business contracts. We adopted the methods of business contracts in terms of writing it out on documents and how you do that, because once we take care of the moral issues, we can adopt common practices of other nations as long as they are just and fair. The Torah only concerns itself with basic principles and moral issues and not the details. And it also explains why the Torah's social laws often append a moral or ethical point of view, which are absent in other codes. In other words, since the Torah is concerned with principles and it's concerned with moral issues, many of our social laws, as we'll see, I have examples of that, append a moral verse to the social law. And all of these, of course, are absent in all other codes. There's no mixture, as we said, of moral issues with social issues. In general, another academic who has Torah, a biblical authority, notes, whereas the Near Eastern laws place great stress on the importance of property, the Torah's value favors the sacredness and equality of human life. That's a big difference. All other codes, whether they're Sumerian, Akkadian, Hittite, Babylonian, all of those focus on property, and human life is secondary. So let me give you examples of the contrasts. Here are examples from the codes of Hammurabi on issues that we have too. In other words, these are laws that appear in our Torah as well as in the codes of Hammurabi, except there's going to be big differences. If a person stole an ox or a sheep, now that's in the Chumash, right? People stole an ox or a sheep. We read that in Mishpatim, and there's a whole Gemara on that. If the thief, according to Hammurabi, if the thief does not have sufficient funds to make restitution to the owner of the ox or the sheep, he shall be put to death. In other words, it's a death penalty for a thief if the thief cannot restore the ox or the sheep. We don't have that at all. There is no death penalty for theft. What has to happen is if the thief cannot restore the cost, then the thief may have to become an indentured servant of the one who he stole from and work off the amount that would be equal to the restitution of the ox or the sheep. Okay, but there's no way, no condition under which a thief is put to death. In Hammurabi, if a man helped a male or a female slave to escape, he shall be put to death. In our system is the opposite. In our system, if a male or female slave escapes and goes to a Jewish home in order to find sanctuary and safety from being abused by the master, the Torah forbids the person who the slave came to, He forbids them to return the slave back to the owner. According to Hammurabi, if he doesn't return him back, or he helps the escapee, then he gets put to death. In this one is a system that's found in all other codes. If a builder constructed a house and it was not strong enough and it collapsed, in other words, a builder, a kablan, constructed a barn and the main beam was not strong enough to hold the roof, and so the roof collapsed. If it caused the death of the son of the owner of the barn, they shall put the son of the builder to death. That's called vicarious punishment. In other words, if you killed the son of somebody else and it was your fault, then your son gets put to death. In Judaism, there is no such thing. There's no such thing as vicarious punishment. You don't punish anybody else. You punish only the person who is guilty of punishment, but not their family and not any other relative and nobody else. There's no vicarious punishment in Judaism. And here's another difference. In the laws of Hammurabi, if a nobleman struck another nobleman's pregnant daughter, okay, so in other words, there was somehow a fight or whatever it is, and the nobleman struck a pregnant daughter. And by the way, that the example of two people fighting, and by accident one of the people hit a pregnant woman, and she died or the baby died, is in the Parsha of Mishpatim. Okay, but ours is very different. In this case, if a nobleman struck another nobleman's pregnant daughter so she died, they shall put his daughter to death. That's vicarious punishment, and that doesn't exist. But look what happens here. If a nobleman struck a commoner's pregnant daughter so she died, he shall pay 30 shekels. In other words, there's a difference between noblemen and commoners in terms of a penalty, a death penalty. In Judaism, we don't have any distinction between rich people and poor people and noblemen and commoners. Everybody, all human beings and all life are equal, and there's no such thing as two different laws for different people who have different status in society. Okay, so all these are examples that Kasuto says that we take something that happens in a society, that is stealing an animal or building a house and the house collapses, or striking another person's child. We take all of those examples and they all appear in Mishpatim, but we change them. We change them because property is not what's important. What's important for us is human life. That's the difference of focus. Saul Berman makes another comment. He says Hammurabi's code provided that an escaped slave who was captured and remanded to the custody of his master, okay, in other words, a slave presumably was mistreated and ran away, and he was caught, and he's brought back to the master. His punishment is to have his ear cut off. Now, we also have a law related to the ear of a slave, okay, but it's entirely different. The Torah mandates that a Hebrew slave who wants to remain with his master and he doesn't want to be freed, he doesn't want to escape because he loves his master, he loves the situation, he doesn't want to be freed after 6 years, according to the law, his ear is pierced. In other words, still there's a mark on an ear. But what the Torah is doing is changing the symbolic significance of marking an ear of a slave from the Hammurabi's code of cutting off his ear to piercing an ear of a slave who wants to remain, and the Torah wants him to be free. In other words, it's an entirely different situation, but the same symbolic ear is used in both cases. The fact that the Torah keeps the penalty in the ear while humanizing it serves to emphasize the transformational intent of the Torah. The Torah thereby teaches us that the ultimate value should not be the owner's property interest in his slave, which is why he could cut off his ear, but the liberation of a slave and his restoration to the proper position as a free citizen. What the piercing of the ear indicates is that Judaism wants the slave to be free, not to be a slave. It has the opposite message, but it's the opposite message that the Torah uses in the same by marking the ear, like the other codes use it in an entirely different way. So what Ksuto is trying to point out, and other people are trying to point out, is that although the Torah and other compendiums may share the same situations that happen in daily life, the Torah's approach to the laws and what you focus on and what the responsibility is and the issues of justice and equality and no vicarious punishment, all of those are what the Torah brings to the system, which distinguishes it from the systems of all other codes of law. Okay, now let's switch out of all of that, go back to Shimshon Raphael Hirsch, and he is going to show us how a simple word or phrase that's used in the Torah. This is the first line of the Parsha, Be'ele HaMishpatim Asher Tasim Lifneihem. Why this particular phrase is used in Mishpatim, and what's its underlying significance. Now, why does it catch his attention? Because we would expect it to say, Ve'ele hamishpatim asher tziva Hashem et Moshe daber el b'nei Yisrael. In other words, we expect a different introduction. We expect it to say, these are the laws which God taught to Moshe to teach to the Bnei Israel. That should be the opening sentence. And here it uses a very strange word, asher tasim, which you are to set before him. So what Shimshon Raphael Hirsch does is to say, what's the nuance of this word, asher tasim, that gives us into insight of why it should be presented with this unusual phrase, asher tasim lifneihem. So he looks it up. He didn't have a concordance at his time, but he knows all the different places that it occurs. So let's see where it occurs. The Hebrew phrase lasim lifnei is used in the Tanakh exclusively for serving specially prepared food to a guest. Very interesting. In other words, what's the connection between the two things? He gives us examples in Breshit, when food was presented before Eliezer, who wanted to tell his whole story and get Rivka as Yitzchak's bride. He said, I will not eat until I have told you what I have to say. But the phrase that's used when food was set before him, Vayusam lefanav le'echol. The Yusam lefanav le'echol was used. In Shmuel Aleph, when they're talking about Shaul, the royal cook, the cook took up a leg of lamb, which was what was on it, and set it in front of Saul. Vayasem lifnei Shaul, the same phrase, Vayasem lifnei. But these are all setting food before people. And similarly, in 20 chapters later, please listen to your servant and let me set before you some food so you may eat. Va'asima lefanecha pat lechem ve'echol. I will present before you to eat. So what catches Hirsch's attention is that this phrase, tasim lifneihem, lasim lifnei, is exclusively used to setting food before somebody. So what does that have to do with mishpatim? So Hirsch notes is the Hebrew for a set and prepared table is a shulchan aruch. And indeed, that is the expression that was used by Yosef Karo when he named his major code of Jewish law the Shulchan Aruch. In other words, the set of laws. The set of laws is imagined as setting a prepared table, a Shulchan Aruch. Why the association with the presentation of food? In other words, what's the nuance and what's it supposed to teach us if we're associating the way the Mishpatim are presented with a prepared table of food? Perhaps more importantly, the image of a prepared and set table presents a contrast to a buffet. The image of a prepared and set table is one of a carefully planned, elegant meal for which the chef arranges each detail. Right? If you go to a chef restaurant, a Michelin chef restaurant, and you have a special person who is coming in, the chef prepares a set menu. There's no menu that's handed to the person to choose what he wants. If there is a dignitary that's at the table of a chef's restaurant, the chef prepares the meal in every detail. The chef determines the order of the courses, the types of condiments, the choice of wines that are served with each course, all calculated to enhance the cumulative culinary experience. So in a prepared and set table, in a Shulchan Aruch, each and every detail represents the expression of the cook's intent and expertise. In contrast, the buffet simultaneously displays a wide range of foods from which guests pick and choose what they want. Either it's set out as a buffet or you have a menu and you choose from your menu. But your choice is based on the individuality of acquired tastes and immediate desires. In other words, when you go in and you're presented with a buffet, so you pick and choose what you want. When a guest chooses from the many possibility, it's a personalized expression of his or her current temporary preference. Like today I want chicken, and another day I want meat, and another day I want salads, or I want this combination of this kind of thing. These preferences change from meal to meal and from day to day. So perhaps the use of the term prepared and set to introduce the laws of the Torah implies that the laws of the Torah were not presented to us as a buffet from which we are to pick and choose based on our individual taste and our feeling. Rather, the Torah's laws were intentionally and carefully formulated in detail, like a table set and prepared before a person, as the unique expression, lasim lifnei, as the unique expression of God's divine will. Thus, the detail of each word and turn of phrase and choice of metaphor and nuance of usage and choice of synonyms in the Torah. In other words, all the way that the laws, the individual laws are presented, all the literary styles are all intentionally meaningful. How the laws are presented are meaningful, and how they're placed, and what's the context, and what's the organization is all purposeful. In other words, the nuance of presenting Eila Hamishpatim Asher Tasim Lifanehem is to say that God, as it were, is the chef and is presenting the laws in a particular way and in a particular method and a particular combination, and all of that is an expression of the divine will. And we are not to relate to it as if it were a buffet that we pick and choose to what we want to do and what we don't want to do, depending on our individual taste or feeling at one time. So here it's a amazing analysis of just a use of a phrase. This is one of Hirsch's quite brilliant analyses. Now let's take some examples of these laws and take a look and see how there is a law presented, and the way it's presented, what the words that are used, and how the moral issue is integrated into the the civil law. So here is kol almana v'yatom lo ta'anun. First of all, lo ta'anun means to mistreat, or to exploit somebody who is weak. And it's the first time it occurs is with Sarah and Avram and Hagar. When Sarah says, I don't want Ishmael around anymore with his mother, and Avram said, do whatever you think is best. So Sarah exploited the fact that Hagar was not his wife, was a surrogate, and not equal to herself. And so she made her feel that she is a servant and she's not a wife. And so she made Hagar flee from the family. So the word ta'anun is used there, and the word here is used also in relationship to a widow and an orphan. Now, what's the association with a widow and an orphan? To understand the underlying ethic, Rabbi Hirsch traces the root of the word almanah to aleph lamed mem, meaning somebody, ilame, somebody who's unable to speak, or a mute. Aleph lamed mem means a mute. The widow, having no husband to represent and protect her, has neither a voice to speak for herself in the ancient Near East, nor a husband to speak for her. I mean, the phrase almana v'yatom is repeated so many times in the Chumash that because they are the most vulnerable people in a society. You picture somebody who has a little plot of land, they have a little farm to support the family, the husband dies. So all that's left is the wife and some children. We don't know how many children. Okay, but in a community, the wife doesn't have a voice. She's not equal. This is before women had any kind of equal status. So, and the children certainly don't have any status. So an almanah, the word almanah, the word widow, implies somebody's unable to speak for herself because her husband is not there to speak to the community in her behalf. So she's vulnerable. And similarly, the word yatom, Hirsch associates, using his linguistic system of phonetic interchangeability, to the rabbinic Hebrew for the word injured limb or amputee, gadam. The idea here is that an orphan, again having no protector, has lost his own power to act independently and lost the guiding and supportive hand of his or her parents. In other words, he's the yatom, the orphan, is as if he doesn't have an arm. He doesn't have a way to act on others independently. He is also vulnerable in a society for abuse. If you know the Dickens story of Oliver, you can see even in the 1800s how orphans were abused because they're vulnerable and they have no support. Okay, so the Torah says, don't you're not allowed to, let's go back to this for a minute. You're not allowed, kol almana v'yatom lo ta'anun. You're not allowed to exploit them, to mistreat them because they are vulnerable in a society. And Hirsch notes where it says kol almana. Why kol? It's like any widow. Why the extra kol? Because he says sometimes an almana may actually be independently wealthy. In other words, not all almanot are poor. They may be wealthy, but they still are vulnerable for exploitation. Since they have no husband, they are vulnerable for somebody else to take advantage of the fact that they have a field that's valuable, or they have a um, something that they produce, pottery or metal or something that has some value to it. They also can be exploited. It doesn't matter if they're rich or poor, but all widows in the society, in the ancient Near East society, were all vulnerable to be taken advantage of by others. Okay, so what the Torah says is im. Now this is the next pasuk. Im ane ta'aneoto. If you do in fact exploit them, and they cry out to me, ki im tza'ok yitzak elai. If they cry out to me, says God, shamoa eshma tza'akato. I will hear their cry. I will hear their cry. Now, Hirsch says, notice that in the pasuk before, it says al ta'anun. Ta'anun is plural. It doesn't say al tancha. Don't you oppress as an individual. It says plural. Why does it say a plural? Because it is the responsibility of the justice system. It's the responsibility of courts to represent the vulnerable, to represent the widow and orphan, and not allow them to be exploited. So that's what this is talking about. If the poor person, the widow, the orphan calls out and there is nobody to hear, the courts don't hear, the courts don't take up the case of the widow and orphan, and that's repeated many times in Nach, when the prophet is criticizing the society. He says, your judges do not take up the cases of the widow and orphan. They don't protect the widow and the orphan. They don't listen to the cry of the widow and orphan. So that was very common, because what does the widow and orphan have to offer them? Nothing. They have nothing to pay. So then they're ignored by the courts. Okay, so the Torah warns, that God warns, and he says, if they have to cry to me because you didn't hear them, I will certainly hear them. And my anger will be aroused, and I will slay you with the sword, you men, so that your wives will become widows and your children become fatherless. Now, this is a hyperbole. It doesn't mean God is going to, all of a sudden kill all the men. But it does mean it's a warning. It's saying, if you're not sensitive and you exploit the widow and orphan, and your justice system does not take up their case, then I will make it so that you're going to suffer one way or the other. You're going to suffer punishment from me, from God directly, for what you did. This is an example of associating a moral value to a social law, which doesn't occur in any other codes of law in any other system. Here's another one, very famous one that many of you are familiar with. Im chavol tachbol salmat riecha. If you take your neighbor's cloak as a pledge, ad bo hashemesh tishivenu lo. When it becomes nighttime, you have to return the pledge. Now, what's it talking about? You have a poor person who needs a loan. Now, often people need a loan. Remember, everybody supports themselves by their own little plot, farming plot. They have to seed. They have to be able to grow things. They grow their own food. They grow things that they can exchange with others. In other words, people may have some vines, may have some vegetables. They may have a wheat field, a cornfield. They may have some things. Okay, and that's what they use to support themselves. But what happens if their farm failed, their crop failed, and they have to borrow money in order to get seeds to plant again in the winter, in order to get a new crop, hopefully for the spring and summer, and be able to support themselves. So they go to somebody and they say, I have to borrow 100 shekel from you to buy seed in order to plant during the winter. And I and here is a security deposit. In other words, the lender has a right to take a security deposit to assure that they're going to be eventually paid back. So the Torah says, well, if the security deposit is their coat, their outer coat, because they don't have very much of value. So if you take their security deposit as their outer coat, when it comes to the evening, you have to give it back to them every night. Kihi ksuto levada, because it's their only covering. Hi simlato leoro, it's what they use to sleep in. Bameh yishkav, so what are they supposed to sleep in the cool night? V'haya ki yitzak elai v'shamati ki chanun ani. And if they have to cry to me because you're not going to give them back what they need to sleep in, and they're going to be up all night shivering, when they cry out to me, I'm going to listen because I'm compassionate and you're apparently not compassionate. It's another moral addendum to a civil law to teach what's morally right. Now, the Rambam takes this and he expands the law. Remember, these laws are principles. So he takes the principle and he says, if a debtor is poor and the creditor holds as a security as a security an object required for the poor person's personal use, in other words, not just his coat, not just his outer garment. Let's say he has a blanket, okay? But what the Rambam says, this is telling you a principle. Anything that he needs for his personal use, the creditor is obligated to return the security to him when he needs it. He has to return his pillow by night, if it's his pillow that is using a security deposit, or his tools or his plow by the day. Because how is he supposed to work his farm if he doesn't have his tools? But if his tools are the only thing that he can give you as a security deposit, you have to give it back to him every day so he can use it. If he failed to return the night article by nighttime or the day article by daybreak, he violates the Torah's prohibition. In other words, he's violating this principle of im tachpol salmat reyecha. Okay, so the Rambam is expanding it because it's a principle. Anything that the person needs, you have to give back to him to use, because otherwise he's not going to be able to be successful. He's not going to be able to live, and he's not going to be able to be comfortable. So you may take something as security. Now, it's interesting. This doesn't imply that there's something wrong with taking a security deposit, right? Luzzatto, who is a famous Jewish philosopher and a scholar in Italy, Shmuel David Luzzatto says the creditor is correct in taking a pledge when the debtor refuses to pay. Not even if he doesn't refuse. In other words, he didn't pay back. Okay, so the creditor is correct in taking a pledge. If the creditor has to return it every evening, the borrower may never pay back the debt. In other words, Luzzatto is saying, well, maybe this isn't fair to the person who's the lender, because if you have to give it back every time he needs it, so why should the borrower have any motivation to pay back? Because he gets his security deposit to use whenever he wants. He has my money. How am I going to get it back? Exclaims the creditor. All will justify him. So in the idea of justice, this is not really fair. It's not fair to require the lender to always give him back the security deposit when he needs it, because then there's no motivation to pay back. So what is the Torah trying to teach you? The Torah says, in what shall he sleep? In other words, Luzzatto is saying, okay, this may not be fair, it may not be just, but what's more important is what is the creditor supposed to sleep in? his discomfort or his inability to work is more important than uh, than you keeping the security deposit and him having something to motivate the creditor to pay back. In other words, this is beyond justice. This is compassion beyond the letter of the law. This sensitivity is further elaborated in Devarim, where a lender cannot invade the privacy of a person to take the pledge. This is what it says in Devarim. When you make a loan of any kind to your neighbor, do not go into his house to get what he is offering as a pledge. In other words, you say, okay, here's your 100 shekel. I'm going to come in and pick out a blanket or a coat or a tool or whatever it is as your security deposit. You're not allowed to do that. You, the one who is making the loan, has to stay outside and let the man to whom you are making the loan bring the pledge out to you. In other words, it's embarrassing for you to go into somebody else's house just because you're lending him money. And it says Kichanun, I am compassionate. A midrash focuses on the power of this last phrase where God says, you have to return the pledge to the person so he's not uncomfortable, that he's able to do his work, that he's able to use what he needs to work, because Kichanun, I'm compassionate. And what the midrash says, each of you, God says to each person, each of you is indebted to me. Every morning, your soul ascends to me, and I render an account and find it lacking. Remember we say, Modeh ani lefanecha melech chai v'kayem shechazarti nishmati bechemla. You return my soul every morning. So God says, when I see your soul, I find it lacking. Nonetheless, I restore it to you each morning despite its indebtedness to me. So you become indebted to me, says God. And yet, I give you back your soul. So when the poor borrower cries to me and says, Lord of the universe, I am a human being just as he is, yet he lies in his bed. He has the comfort of a bed and a blanket. And as for me, I don't have anything to sleep in. So God says, if you don't return his pledge, I shall not feel obligated to return your soul. It's a very powerful midrash that is picking up the nuance of the morality behind this simple law. So this is the way the issue. This is the way Jewish law is, and it's a amazing system. The whole Jewish system of law is an amazing system. And it's something that we're going to now, it starts, all the Jewish law starts, and we're going to study Jewish law throughout the rest of the books, throughout all the books when they come up, and see that all civil law is really moral law, and they're teaching values and laws of justice, even in rituals, even in symbolic stuff.
Steve, thank you.